This is just too inaccurate.
Well then, you're definitely not going to like my steam-powered super spider with the stepping and the squishing and the webs made of nylon.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the Jon Peters to my giant mechanical spider, my co-host, Nate Story. That feels mean for you. Like, I don't want you to have to be Jon Peters.
You'd rather I be a giant mechanical spider?
I don't think either of us are Jon Peters. Neither of us have that luxurious head of hair that guy has.
That is true. But the point being that, that is true love. Jon Peters and giant mechanical spider. That
is true. There is no love like Jon Peters and a giant mechanical spider. We're going to get into it because this week we watched Barry Sonnenfeld's 1999 box office flop, Wild Wild West, which you might remember from such Simpson episodes as Season 13's The Sweetest Apu. And, it's funny, Nate, because we often sort of talk about where do we draw the line for the Simpsons episodes? And we've sort of been saying like Season 12, Season 13. And it's funny because this is one of those episodes that I do vividly remember watching in real time. And I must have like taped it on my like VHS of 8 hours of Simpsons episodes because I remember watching it a lot, like rewatching the episode. I was like, oh, like this is an episode I've seen many, many times. Like I was shocked at how many lines in this I quote to this day. In fact, I feel like you and I quote this episode quite a lot to each other. There's one specific line that I remember you always saying.
Yeah, I know exactly the line, which is, ooh, a challenge.
That's the one. Yeah, as soon as I heard that line, I was like, Nate used to always say that. It is funny how in our minds, like, we sort of don't really recognize these later seasons as much as we think. And then we get to them and we're like, oh, actually, no, I vividly remember this. And I think this is a really fun episode. So let's talk about The Sweetest Apu, Season 13, Episode 19, directed by Matthew Nastic, written by John Swartzwelder, which I have to admit I'm a little surprised by. It doesn't feel as Swartzwelder-y as some of his other stuff. And original air date, May 5th, 2002, 3 years after the release of the movie. So we would have both been in the 8th grade. So that's probably why it's sort of like right in that peak era where, I'm still tuning in every single Sunday night, appointment viewing. But Nate, talk us through the reference here.
Yeah, so I feel like this opening is maybe the most Swartzwelderian part of this episode in some ways.
Definitely.
The whole idea that the town's getting together for a Civil War reenactment feels very up his alley. And I feel like he's maybe even done some jokes about this type of thing in the past. But yeah, so basically, I think it's the first 5.5 minutes of this episode is just this Civil War reenactment set piece.
The Second Battle of Springfield was fought by the North, the South, and the East. To keep Springfield in, out of, and next to the Union, respectively. Now, the actual battle was fought over there, where that man is standing, but he won't move, so we'll do it here.
You get all the different characters from around town to play all these different roles. You have, Skinner as the referee, and, you have, Homer and Barney on the Union side. He's sober at this point, but Homer offers him a beer, and...
Yeah, because you can't play Ulysses S. Grant without having a drink.
Right.
Which I'm assuming is a reference to the fact that Ulysses S. Grant was a famous drunk. Not being American, I don't really have a lot of Civil War history knowledge.
This is also Swartzwelder shit, Let's have a joke about a Civil War general.
Right.
There's a lot of really great gags in here, but it's all ramping up to the giant spider moment where Professor Frink comes out with the giant mechanical spider from this movie. He's dressed in exactly the same outfit as the villain, Dr. Loveless. Is it Dr. Loveless?
Yeah.
And just kind of stomping through the battlefield and throwing nets on people and all of that kind of stuff. But it's I don't think I totally picked this up. Maybe it just doesn't come through, but it's supposed to be an escalating series of events about how inaccurate the reenactment is, right? It sort of starts off almost normal, and then gets weirder and weirder, and like people are playing cards on the field, and then like all of the veterans come with their like tanks and like roll in and turn the tide of the war, and then you get the spider as the kind of like, you know, the topper, as they say.
Yeah, it's great. You had mentioned that this was the episode to watch, and I like sat down to watch it, and I remembered the episode. I was like, oh, this is the one where Apu has an affair. I'm like, I don't remember there being any Wild Wild West stuff in it. And then I saw the Civil War thing, and I was like, did Nate just like pick this because it's set during the Civil War, and like that's where this is going? I mean, I guess the henchman in Wild Wild West has like a Civil War vibe. Right. And then sure enough, the spider shows up. I'm like, oh no, it's like a full-on reference to the movie.
I can hold the nylon has been released.
It's one of those weird things of like, that was the cultural takeaway from this movie that didn't, you know, wasn't particularly successful, but everyone does remember the giant mechanical spider.
Right. I don't really remember the trailers for this movie, but like, was that in the trailers or was that a surprise for people and like everyone just remembered the surprise? I
don't remember the trailers either.
I feel like the moment where the spider comes over the ridge, I kind of remember that maybe being in the trailer.
And it's one of those things too where I remember I had heard about the spider, but I don't remember if I knew about the spider because of the Kevin Smith thing or if I knew about the spider because I saw the movie. So anyway, the two most iconic things are probably the spider and the end credits song, which we'll get into. Wow. You caught that there's a number of other references in here that, you know, I have to admit, most of these went over my head. Maybe our more astute listeners caught these, but talk us through some of the other confirmed references you found.
Yeah. So during the Civil War scene, Homer gets a keg from Apu's Quickie Mart, right? Like that's kind of the very beginning of this. And then it gets punctured on the field by a bayonet. And Homer's sort of mourning it. And he goes, so cold, so cold. And he's like trying to, you know, tend to the wound. And apparently that is a reference to Catch-22, which I think it's a line in the book, but I haven't seen the movie. So I'm like, it might be also in the movie or it might not. I don't actually know.
It also leads to one of my favorite gags, which is when Homer returns the keg. When he's like,
now, Apu, when you gave me this keg, it had dents, and here's proof.
Turns the thing, and it says, it's got writing on it, which makes it, and he also spells Apu wrong, and it's very funny, and it made me laugh out loud.
Yeah, that's a good one. So the whole plot of this, right, is Apu has an affair with the squishy lady, and Homer finds out about this and then is, like, racked with guilt about it. And so he has a dream about Apu and the squishy lady. And at one point, Apu says to the squishy lady, please do the Hindu that you do so well, which is a line from a song called You Do Something to Me, except that instead of Hindu, it's voodoo, right? But that is actually from a movie called 50 Million Frenchmen. So it was written for that movie and then quoted again in Blazing Saddles very famously. This is the oldest confirmed reference in this episode in 1931.
Wow. Okay.
There's a really good one from The Godfather, and it's when they're rewatching the video of Apu and Manjula's wedding, and Homer is singing in sort of like fake Italian, which is right out of the beginning of the
Yeah.
Hey, Manjula, canticala, vinna pericola. Ay, 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 che canto c'è cola ricca ponno valere. Hey!
Which is a pretty deep cut from that movie, but very memorable if it's a movie you've seen many times. You instantly recognize it, I feel like.
Yeah, it's the fact that they start singing the song and then like this very, very elderly man joins them on stage to sing the sort of like finals. That's what I vividly remember is like it cutting to the man in the oversized suit jacket singing this Italian wedding song.
Yeah, and Homer is specifically doing the old man part, for sure.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this one in our episode on My Fair Lady, but of course, Apu and the octuplets perform My Fair Lady for Manjula. It's on her list of things that he has to do to make up to her. All right. This one's interesting because it was actually in the commentary, but was not anywhere online, which I think sort of speaks to the fact that, like, as you go on in the series, the online activity around episodes kind of declines a little bit.
Right.
The part at the end where Homer is watching Apu and Manjula having sex is based on a scene from National Lampoon's Animal House. It's like a peeping scene, and the whole like backing up, the extended backing away is sort of like an exaggeration of, I think, what happens in that movie.
Gotcha. I do love that moment. It's one of my favorite gags in the episode. I mean, there's a lot of gags in this episode I really like, but the extended backing up of Homer, where he literally backs up all the way home and then into his bed, is very, very funny. And I feel like it's something we referenced a lot growing up.
Yeah, the backing away. And the thing I love about that scene too is the sort of extended score that goes behind it, where it actually
it just kind of loops.
It noticeably restarts a couple times. I think.
Yeah,
which is pretty funny.
It's very funny. Very, very funny.
Okay. I do also have some mystery references here. And again, these are ones that are unconfirmed or are just like, maybe it's a reference, maybe it's not. It's kind of hard to tell. The first one is one that I found on the internet that claims that when Manjula first kicks Apu out of the apartment and the kids hiss at him, that's a reference to a movie called The Brood, which is a movie I have not seen. But
it's like an early Cronenberg movie.
Oh, okay. And supposedly the kids hiss in that movie, but it's like, it feels like it might be too generic. I don't know if that's really a reference to that movie or not. It's kind of outside of their usual wheelhouse in terms of like what they reference. Like there's very little Cronenberg in The Simpsons, unfortunately, other than The Fly.
Right.
So not sure about that one. This is one that I feel like I'm leaning a little bit more towards yes, which is when they try to invite Apu and Manjula over to their house to make them make up. And Marge says,
"Look who's here! It's this thing!"
And the kids come out dressed up as Ganesha.
Yeah.
And Bart says, "Well, I'll suck your blood," right? I feel like it's a reference to the 1931 Dracula, right? And like the performance in that. But it's one of those things where it's like it's been so morphed by pop culture over time. Yeah. Where it's like he never says that, I don't think, in the movie, but it's become the shorthand for that performance.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think it's probably a pop culture Dracula reference, whether or not it's a specific moment in the 1931 film. That maybe not, but everyone knows that what he's doing is he's riffing on the Bela Lugosi Dracula. But that feels definitely accurate.
Yeah, one day we'll do that movie and we'll talk about the pop culture legacy of it and how it's kind of like morphed over time. And the whole like blah thing is very much tied to Bela Lugosi's performance, but like is probably not that accurate to how it really goes. Anyway. Okay. At one point, the squishy lady ties a knot with licorice in her mouth.
Well, more specifically, she ties "do me" with licorice.
Yes. Yes. Which I feel like was something that was like having a cultural moment kind of in the late 90s, maybe, or maybe even earlier than that. But one place where it does happen is in Twin Peaks, where Audrey does this on the show. I was trying to do some research about like, where does this start? And of course, it's like a thing that people did as like a bar trick, basically. And there's some guy who is like the most famous guy in the world for doing this. But Twin Peaks is this major cultural moment for it. And then I think another, like an actress does it on a late night show as well. And that's also like this big sort of cultural moment around that.
Yeah, it's definitely something that like was, I don't even really understand why it was shorthand for sexy, but like, I know that there were girls we went to high school with who like could do that. And all the boys were impressed. And then like, when you think about it, you're like, why is this impressive? Like when you're 13 years old and you're a virgin, silly. You're like, ooh. But exactly.
Hachi machi. A couple others, I'll just run through these quickly, but like, these are ones where I have no idea what it would be a reference to, but it feels like it's a little outside of the reality of The Simpsons, and it's so specific that maybe it is a reference to something. So Homer's dream of India. Right? Feels like the thing that comes to mind, because I know they've referenced this before, is there's like this whole series of buddy movies called The Road to Blank, right?
Yep.
And so like it feels kind of in that vein to me, because it's like those movies are always like they go to India and then get into a series of wacky situations, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think visually it sort of reminded me of like movies like The Thief of Baghdad and Aladdin, Prince of Thieves. Not the Disney movie, but like the live action sort of all that stuff that they sort of did in, I want to say silent era and like maybe like early sound era. Even the whole like the eunuch thing, like that was definitely something from those movies and stuff.
Totally. Yeah, it's like it's Homer's idea of what India is like, and it's very clearly supposed to be like a pop culture version of India and not accurate. And that's why I'm like, it's picking from something, but I'm not totally sure what. Okay. Homer's daydream about being a supervillain where he has the glider and the lasers.
You can run, but you can't glide.
That might just be like a fun visual thing, but it also feels like, well, okay, is this referencing a specific like comic book character or something like that? Hard to say. I tried looking it up, but I don't feel like there was anything that jumped out as being obvious on that one.
Right.
And then the tap dancing lawyer.
Yeah, I feel like the character, or at least like the voice, it must be referencing something, someone or something from a movie or TV show, but I couldn't quite place it either. But like, you're right. It feels like that. Maybe not necessarily the tap dance part. That's just, supposed to be this guy's glee at being so evil. But
right. I mean, they say on the commentary that it's just an amalgam of various lawyers that they've dealt with in the past. I feel like one of the writers on the commentary talks about like kind of going through a divorce. I don't think it's this episode, but like around this time. And I kind of wonder if that's what, they're drawing from in terms of like their evil caricature of lawyers.
Yeah, maybe.
Adam, is there anything else in this episode that stands out to you? You mentioned just really loving this episode, and I have a bunch of stuff that like I love and quote all the time from this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, we referenced a challenge, which we always referenced.
Yes, but look at the delivery man. He is hideous.
Oh, a challenge.
The joke that which is not even a joke, but it's something I frequently say, and it's lost on literally everyone else around me, is when I say, put in a good word for grape. I can't even remember the context for why I would say it. If someone's like, okay, I got to go do this, and I'll be like, well, put in a good word for grape. So that's something I say frequently for some reason. I love when probably my favorite scene in the whole episode is when Marge and Homer remember that they're going to play badminton, or as Marge calls it, badminton, tomorrow. Yeah. And she says, I hope there's no awkward double entendres. And then, of course, you just get a series of them.
Are you sure you're not cheating?
Oh.
What's the score?
Dirty love. I mean, 30 love.
And then Homer just straight up says,
anyone for penis? I'll just get the shuttlecock. Oh.
That's a classic Simpsons thing of like, we're going to be witty and clever, and then we're just going to actually like, hat on a hat kind of thing. And then you get the shuttlecock joke, which I always think is funny. And I don't think I knew until this episode that that's what a badminton thing is called the shuttlecock. So
yeah, I love, oh my God, so many things. Where to start? Okay, James Lipton doing the Actors Studio.
I forgot that, and it's actually him too, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It just shows what a good sport that guy was.
Totally. Let me get into character. Okay, I'm McBain.
Yeah,
that's a pretty good gag. This is like a one that they do several different times when I think it's Homer teaches the octuplets, or maybe Marge teaches the octuplets to get them to have Manjula give
Apu. Yeah.
Right, and they go, Mommy, will you let Daddy come back? Cookie. There's another one like exactly like that where they're flipping TV channels.
Yes.
And it's the exact same thing where it's like they say a full sentence and then there's one extra word. Gets me every time.
Totally. Yeah, you have written here, one of the things that I love too is when Apu's looking at the chart of reincarnation, and he says that next he'll be a tapeworm and then assistant to Lorne Michaels, which is just obviously somebody must have worked at Saturday Night Live. I mean, obviously there is a Simpsons Saturday Night Live connection along the way, but it's that must have been a subtle dig at somebody's former boss. So
yeah, it's gonna be a hard couple lifetimes. Okay, here's one that I didn't even notice until this time. When they get the Fudge Mahal delivered to their house, and Homer, and then I think they have to turn it away, and they must have looped this in afterward, where Homer goes, "Can I lick your fingers? Meet me at the mail slot."
Yes, that is great. That is great. Yeah, like I said, it is funny that this is one of those episodes where I just vividly remember watching it, rewatching it, quoting it, and it actually happens to be one of the sort of like later period episodes from sort of our standpoint, which just goes to show that, like, everyone who says, the show fell off at season 9 or 10 or whatever, no, it didn't. It just, as our friend Matt said, it's like the show evolved and I evolved and we evolved differently. But I think this is a really, really solid episode. But with that, let's tuck into the film, because I'm really excited to talk about this movie, because I think a lot of people have this idea of what this movie is. And, we alluded to it in the intro that it's this like massive box office bomb in a pretty iconic year for cinema. But watching it for this episode, I had sort of an interesting opinion that we can reveal in a little bit. But I guess that leads me to, Nate, how would you sum this movie up in a sentence?
I think there's a really easy way to sum it up, which would be to say it's James Bond in the Wild West.
Yeah, that is the pitch, really.
That's the pitch, right? There's lots of other stuff that happens, but like that's basically what this is. You have a Bond girl, you have a villain that's very sort of Bondian with like a big silly plot. The main difference, I guess, is that it's a buddy cop thing as well, right?
Yeah.
Very much in the vein of Men in Black or Lethal Weapon. But yeah, broadly, it's James Bond in the Wild West.
Wow. Yeah, pretty much. Well, let's take a look at the plot synopsis from the 1999 VHS, which, Nate, you put in the notes here. Hard to believe this came out on VHS, but they continued to be produced until 2006. And I think it's one of these funny things that, like, the DVD era comes along and sort of changes everything, but we kind of forget just what a long tail VHS actually had. Like, as I said, I was taping stuff off of TV onto VHS late into high school, like probably still at the end of high school. It was only in the last 2 years of high school that I got a DVD burner. Anyway, here's the plot synopsis from that VHS. If you think Special Government Agent James West is fast with a six-shooter, wait till he lays a quip on you. Mega hit star Will Smith plays West, reuniting with Men in Black director Barry Sonnenfeld in an effects-loaded shoot-from-the-lip spectacular. Kevin Kline plays fellow agent and crackerjack inventor Artemis Gordon, teamed with Wes on a daring assignment. Stop legless Dr. Arliss Lovelace, say that 10 times fast, played by Kenneth Branagh, in his diabolical plot for disunited States of America. Salma Hayek is mysterious adventuress Rita Escobar, and all manner of geared-up 1860s gadgets, from belt-buckle derringers to surprise-packed billiard balls to a walking 8-story steam and steel tarantula, help make Wild Wild West, produced by Sonnenfeld and Batman's Jon Peters, a wow wow West. Oh, Jesus Christ.
Way too many puns in this one.
Oh my God, yeah.
Shoot from the lip, Adam.
Bad.
How many VHS descriptions include the producer in the description? That feels unusual.
I mean, if they're a celebrity, if Steven Spielberg is the producer, but he's not the director or something like that.
Sure.
But I don't think Jon Peters is a celebrity producer.
No, because Spielberg is a director. Right, like that's
what I mean. If Francis Ford Coppola produces a small indie movie,
right?
They did that with Sleepy Hollow. Like it says, produced by Francis Ford Coppola, and Tim Burton's like, wait, it was, and he had nothing to do with it. They just slapped his name on it. But again, it's when they're famous for probably doing something else, and they happen to be a producer. But Jon Peters is just a producer, and
we will talk about a lot with this movie. But yeah. He is just a producer who's just been involved in a lot of high-profile things, but I don't know if it's totally a selling point.
I imagine that was a contractual requirement from Mr. Peters based on what we know about him. So
100%.
So Nate, what is your background with this movie? Had you seen it prior to us watching it for this?
So I don't think I had ever seen it because, again, its reputation precedes it as being yes. An all-time bad movie. I think that's fair to say. But I am a huge fan of Sonnenfeld's Men in Black in particular. I think I've also seen a couple other of his movies, but Men in Black, I think, is kind of amazing. It's one of the great 90s blockbusters, one of the great 90s sci-fi movies. It's a great Will Smith movie. Do you remember there was a cartoon version of Men in Black as well?
Oh, yeah. Yep,
yeah,
definitely.
I used to watch that. I love the world of Men in Black. So, I feel like that gave me a fair amount of leeway to this movie where I'm okay, show me what you got, right? I know it's supposed to be bad, but there are a lot of people coming back from Men in Black for this movie. And so, we'll get into it, but I think probably the highlights of the movie are the spots where it feels the most like Men in Black. But yeah, what about you, Adam?
Yeah, I vaguely remember seeing parts of it on TV at my cousin's house. Like one time I was staying at my cousin's because they had a pool, and probably came in from the pool and like just turned on the TV, and they had satellite before anybody else, and so like there was always a movie channel, and I would always just turn on the movie channel, and so I like vaguely remember seeing bits and pieces of it, but never the whole thing. And like you, I loved Men in Black and still love Men in Black. I think Men in Black is probably the reason this movie gets made. Even the fact that Will Smith is in it, like that's clearly him riding high off of the success of Men in Black and Independence Day. So I guess this is where I'm going to sort of lay my pieces down, is that going into this, I was like, okay, famous box office flop, famous terrible movie. I know the Kevin Smith story. I know that there's this like shoehorn giant mechanical spider. Not looking forward to this. On my media server that I use to stream movies from my computer down to my TV, I think this had like 0.5 stars or maybe 1 star. Like the rating. I was going into it being like, oh boy, this is going to be a Day of the Dolphin situation. And I came away from it, and I think I literally texted you at the end being like, am I crazy, or was like that not terrible? Like I really enjoyed myself. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that movies like this don't really get made anymore, and like the big budget action adventure movie has become so formulaic. I mean, essentially it's just comic book movies now. Like you would never get something this sort of like wacky and out there, but I really enjoyed myself, and I was like, I don't understand why this movie gets the sort of like flogging that it's getting. Like it's not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but like it's by no means the worst movie I've watched in the last decade. Like I would pick this over basically any Marvel movie that has come out in the last 5 years, like easily.
Right. Yeah. I think when we first started talking about doing this movie on the podcast, I had recently seen Ant-Man Quantumania.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was really comparing this movie to that movie. And there are a lot of commonalities. Like these days, if this came out, barring some like very dated parts of this movie, fair enough, right? But barring that stuff, you would be like, oh, this is like kind of a disappointing Marvel movie. But it still doesn't break everyone's trust with, Marvel. Like everyone's waiting for Marvel to get good again. But like, I don't think it's totally dead, whereas like this was treated like it was the end of the world, like it was just an absolute bomb. But even when you look at the box office, we'll get to the specifics, but the box office wasn't that bad, compared to some of the other movies that we've talked about, like Paint Your Wagon, for example. It's more the critical reception and the feeling of audiences that they were almost betrayed by the movie is more to the point than like its actual financial success,
Yeah, I kind of feel like this movie landed Barry Sonnenfeld in like director jail for a while, like because I can't think of anything that really came out that he did after. Okay, no, I'm looking at it now, and he actually he made quite a few movies after this, so maybe not. But okay,
but not these kinds of movies, right? I mean, it kind of changes.
Well, he made two more Men in Black sequels, so he returned to that well, and then the movie RV, which I don't know if you remember that movie with Robin Williams. And then the last movie he directed is 9 Lives, which is the Kevin Spacey becomes a cat movie. That, if memory serves, dropped like right around the time the Kevin Spacey stuff happened. So it very sort of quickly disappeared.
Brutal.
But anyway.
He actually hasn't done that many movies now that I look at it. It's like 3 Men in Black movies, 2 Addams Family movies, Wild Wild West, Get Shorty, and then like some other ones that are a little less known, I mean, we're going to get into this, I'm sure, but of course it has to be said that like Barry Sonnenfeld was, prior to being a director, was best known as the Coen brothers cinematographer. He shot all the best looking Coen brothers movies. Well, until they start working with Roger Deakins. But he's a very interesting figure, which I'm sure we're going to get into. And to that point, Nate, let's get into the background. How did this thing get made? I mean, because I have to imagine that's also part of this, is that like everybody in Hollywood knows that Jon Peters got involved, and it's just like he poisoned the well from the outset. Yeah, pretty much. Again, what did we talk about this? This is part of this 90s trend of reviving old TV series, right? Like Mission Impossible, like all of those sort of old TV
The
series
Avengers.
that people had kind of like forgotten about a little bit. Like they're from a previous generation. And there was this sort of trend in Hollywood of like reintroducing these as movies, as movie series, right? And this is like another in a long line of those. So all that to say, Wild Wild West was a TV series back in the day, which was pitched as James Bond in the West. But by this time, most moviegoers would have like no idea that this was even based on something.
It's funny because I think it was during the pandemic, Wild Wild West got added to like Amazon Prime, and my dad started watching it again, and he was like telling me, I started rewatching Wild Wild West. And I remember as a kid him telling me about it because he loved the show as a kid.
Yeah.
And telling me about it and being like, oh, you should check it out. And I couldn't be bothered at this point because it's like, I got enough TV to watch. I'm not going to go back and rewatch this like James Bond Western. But it is funny because it got me thinking about, I don't think we really dug into this that much when we did James Bond in our first episode, but it's weird to think about the cultural impact that James Bond had on just pop culture and everything back then, and that everything had to be spy related. I guess it's probably around Goldfinger because that's the one that sort of breaks through. But it's like you get stuff like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., you get The Avengers, you get this, where it's like much like the MCU has this like ripple effect on pop culture for the next like decade, and everything has to start being like, we have to have a cinematic universe and everything comic book related, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
James Bond kind of had that effect for a period. But then James Bond also sort of falls into the trap of like, okay, now we're no longer as culturally relevant, so we have to start riffing on what's culturally relevant, and that's how you get like James Bond in space or blaxploitation James Bond. And so it's like this weird thing of like, it becomes a thing that everybody's chasing for a while, and then it starts chasing whatever trend is going on. It's such an interesting franchise to me for that reason, and why I want to always discuss it whenever I can. But enough about James Bond. Back to Wild Wild West.
Yeah. So the original version of this, when it was first pitched, would have actually been written by Shane Black and directed by Richard Donner.
Oh, that is a very different movie.
Can you imagine?
Holy crap. Yeah, that is a wildly different film.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is when I rewatched this, God help me, yesterday, since we were sort of planning this for a long time and wanted to do it earlier, and I needed a refresher, and I listened to the commentary, and apparently the final fight on top of the spider, a lot of the ideas in that actually came from Shane Black.
Okay.
So I don't know whether that means that like some portion of a script he wrote continued all the way from the beginning to the end, or he came on as a consultant near the end, which would have also been totally possible because this was like one of those movies where there were like 24 writers involved or whatever at some point. So anyway, interesting to hear that his influence still kind of remained, and certainly the like buddy cop dynamic is very much in Shane Black's wheelhouse.
100%.
So that part
yeah,
makes
very
sense.
much so.
Sense.
Yeah, definitely.
It ends up being directed by Barry Sonnenfeld and written by, again, a long succession of people, but two of the folks that kind of get a fair amount of credit for a specific part of this movie are Brent Maddock and Steven Wilson. And all three of those folks watched the show as kids too and like loved the show. And they actually like went to a lot of trouble to try to like capture the vibe of the show. They like went back and rewatched it and like kind of analyzed what were the key elements. They talked to a fan club about like what they should include and that kind of stuff, which is really interesting because I don't know if that really comes across. There were probably some other things that really go against the series, which we'll get to, but like Barry Sonnenfeld cast Will Smith specifically to be like, this is not your father's Wild Wild West. Wow. So right from the beginning, you're telling people actually like just temper your expectations. We're not remaking the TV show, basically.
Which I think was sort of, the film that exemplifies that is Mission Impossible. At the risk of spoiling the first Mission Impossible movie, the fact that they kill off Jim Phelps in the first 15 minutes of the movie, only to reveal that he's actually the villain. Fans of the TV series were up in arms about that because like, how can you take the hero of the TV series and turn him into a villain? But like that film really sort of turned, it's like, we're Mission Impossible in like name only and maybe like vibes, but otherwise like, yeah, we're not your parents' Mission Impossible. So like that sort of sets the template moving forward, I think, for a lot of these sort of reboots of, 1960s pop culture phenomenons.
Right. I mean, in some ways, like that version of it actually is kind of a Lego sequel, in a weird way. It's, that one in particular, because you actually have like the character returning and all of that. But yeah, like this is almost like the Lego sequel of its time, which is just like, let's go back and rescue this old IP and kind of revive it, and takes advantage of the smaller or latent fandom of these things, but then also introduce a whole bunch of new people to it and like rebuild the fandom. All right, so Jon Peters, we got to talk about Jon Peters.
Yeah, we do.
I mean, so much has been said about Jon Peters, so like I don't think we need to like relitigate his whole history too much, but like he's very famous for starting his career as a hairdresser before meeting Barbra Streisand. Soon after What's Up, Doc, actually. So a nice little connection to the pod. And then he became a movie producer on Streisand's A Star Is Born from 1976. And that kind of like launches his career as a movie producer. But he was a very eccentric guy, to say the least. Also a very problematic guy. But like, if you like go and look at his filmography and any kind of like weird, outlandish, or inappropriate moments from those movies, and there are some good movies on that list that you remember, are probably because of Jon Peters. So a classic example, we covered Batman 1989 on this podcast. We talked at length about the Prince soundtrack and whether we liked it or not. Guess whose idea that was? Jon Peters. Jon Peters was not only the mastermind behind integrating Prince and like making Tim Burton's Life a Living Hell, but also he was the one who wanted the Prince Michael Jackson dueling themes whole thing that never totally materialized. So those are the types of ideas that he introduces into movies. He's also super canceled after losing a lawsuit for sexual harassment of an assistant on Superman Returns in 2006. And there's also this interesting sort of thing with Bradley Cooper as well. So because Peters owned the rights to A Star Is Born, he technically was a producer on the 2018 remake that Bradley Cooper sort of helms, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But Cooper claims, like, at the time, he didn't really know about the sexual harassment stuff. Who knows, right? I'm not here to question whether he did or didn't, but that's what he says. But the interesting thing is that Cooper, after this whole debacle, then goes on to play Jon Peters in Licorice Pizza in 2021, which is probably, like, the funniest take on Jon Peters and, like, such a great way to kind of get a feel for what this guy was like. You know, I've listened to interviews with him, and I feel like actually Cooper's performance is pretty accurate to the vibe of Jon Peters. So, yeah, go see that.
So, I mean, we don't necessarily need to cover it because, as you say, it's been covered in so many different things. But Jon Peters has had this obsession with like a giant spider. And the two sort of best things, if you want to learn more about the giant spider thing, is An Evening with Kevin Smith. He has this very long section of his special dedicated to telling the story of how when he was hired to write Superman Return, what was it called? Well, was it called Superman Returns at that time? I can't remember. But anyway,
Superman Lives, I think.
Superman Lives, yeah, whatever. Anyway,
or maybe that's
point,
the documentary. Anyway.
Yeah, and the point is that Kevin Smith tells the story about how he was hired by Jon Peters, and one of the things that he was required to incorporate into this script was this giant spider thing. But then there's this great documentary about the making or the non-making of that they actually do interview Jon Peters. And so you get Jon Peters' side of the story about why he wanted the giant spider, why he was obsessed with the giant spider. And you get to really see a lot of the Jon Peters like personality and like see his house and see what, like, he really is the classic sort of like crazy movie producer that is parodied in all sorts of stuff, including like Scream 3 and things like that. Right. Yeah, if you want to learn more about all that, because we don't have enough time to cover all of this, definitely go check out the Kevin Smith thing and check out that Death of Superman documentary, which is on, I think it's on like Vimeo or whatever. It was a Kickstarter that I'm pretty sure I kickstarted, like chipped in some money, and that's why I have it. But it's also just interesting to sort of like find out about this like lost Tim Burton Superman that almost starred Nicolas Cage, and it's well worth checking out. But like Kevin Smith is not exaggerating, and then of course, you know, the button on the story is Kevin Smith is like, then I go see Wild Wild West, and there's the fucking spider, and so he finally got his spider in his movie. But
he did the like Leo pointing at the screen meme.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting because like he does talk a little bit in Night with Kevin Smith about King Kong actually, and like wanting the King Kong moment of the spider being sort of revealed like through the doors like King Kong and that whole thing. And King Kong famously has a like missing scene or like a lost scene of the spider pit,
which is in the Peter Jackson remake, if I'm not, which I have not actually seen. But
I think he does recreate it. I think because again, it's like it's completely lost. Like I don't think we have footage of it, but it was sort of like an idea that was floating around, and I was wondering to myself because I know Jon Peters was also excited about adding things from Star Wars because they were rescreening in the 90s. He wanted to add ideas from Star Wars to Superman, right?
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And so I was wondering, was this sort of in the pop culture too? Like King Kong was rescreening and he saw it and was hearing people talk about the spider pit. And I don't know. Anyway, so that's my pet theory, but I'm gonna have to go watch that. I haven't seen that documentary and I've heard it's really fun.
I'll send it to you because I have a copy of it. And like you, I think, knowing that you're a big like Burton fan, the filmmaker interviewed Tim Burton in his like Gothic castle. And it's interesting to hear Burton's sort of like perspective on the whole thing. So
cool. Yeah. Definitely going to check that out.
But back to Wild Wild West.
The bottom line with this movie, and this is what I was sort of nodding at before, this movie has a huge budget, which is part of its problem. $170 million, one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time. I would say that like a good chunk of it is up on the screen.
I was going to say, I think it's like money well spent. This movie does look pretty friggin' good.
Yep. But I would also say that there's probably a lot of money spent on, there were a lot of reshoots. Again, so many different writers that came through and did passes and all this sort of stuff.
Right.
That like, I bet a good chunk of that also just went to like paying people, inefficiencies, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of inflated it even higher than it was before because like, it looks great. I would say it probably looks about on par with Men in Black. And I don't think Men in Black quite hit this number. So Sophia Ang, the actress who played Miss Lippenreader, figured that Warner Brothers spent about 20 to 40 million to respond to bad test screenings. But here's the thing. It didn't exactly bomb at the box office. It actually made 222 million. So it made back its budget. Not a huge hit, but you know, not as bad as you'd think, I think, based on the reputation of this movie. So yeah,
it has this weird reputation that is I don't think entirely earned. So, well, let's talk about whether or not it's earned. Maybe we have a differing opinion, but let's start where we always like to start, which is with the cast, because it's got, a pretty stacked cast when you consider it. I mean, maybe not in 1999 it was necessarily as stacked, but like looking back on it and you go, holy crap, the caliber of cast is pretty impressive.
Totally. We have Will Smith, of course. We have Kevin Kline as Artemis Gordon, his sort of whatever buddy in this movie. We have Salma Hayek as Rita Escobar, bit of a thankless role, if I'm honest. And then Kenneth Branagh as the villain, Dr. Arliss Lovelace. So why don't we start up at the top and talk about Will Smith and Kevin Kline? I feel like we got to talk about them as a unit to start because they're supposed to be the buddy cops at the middle of this movie.
Yeah.
Apparently, again, I'm not super familiar with the TV show, but the dynamic on the TV show apparently is that Jim West is the straight man and Artemis Gordon is the sort of like witty, wacky sidekick character.
Right.
Who would you say is the straight man in this movie?
Well, I think it's intended to keep that idea that like Jim West is the grounded character and Artemis is the wacky character. But by casting Will Smith, who can't help himself but have sort of like the Will Smithism. Look, I'm just going to say it. I think Will Smith is miscast in this film. I think
wow, really? Okay.
I like Will Smith as an actor, but I think he's coming off of a series of movies where he's doing the Will Smith sort of shtick of like, fast talking, witty. It's the Men in Black thing. Like he's playing the funny man to Tommy Lee Jones' complete straight man.
Totally.
And he can't shake that for this film. I think he eventually gets better at playing straight man roles and like playing more serious roles. But watching this movie, I feel like you can see him working. Like you can see him not being able to push that aside. He doesn't fully let Kevin Kline just be the funny guy and him be the straight guy. And that sort of harms the dynamic a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think Kevin Kline, on the other hand, is fucking firing on all cylinders and he's one of the greatest every time he's in something, I'm like, that guy rules. Why is he not in more things? I love Kevin Kline, but yeah, the dynamic isn't quite working right.
Yeah, so I totally agree on Kevin Kline. I like Will Smith in this too. I just think that their dynamic doesn't work. They just never quite found the balance of like, what is their relationship to each other, Mm-hmm. From what I was reading behind the scenes, neither of them really wanted to play the straight man. And so there's your problem, like at the root of it.
Well, yeah, totally.
But then you need some other kind of dynamic. And it could be that like, one of them evolves in one direction or one of them evolves in another direction, and maybe they like sort of swap roles throughout the film or something like that. But it doesn't ever really do that. It feels chaotic in the way that they interact. Like scene to scene, you never know exactly who's going to be playing what role or like what their relationship is going to be. I feel like that's one of the sort of core weaknesses of this movie, even though, again, like I like both of their performances kind of individually. It's just their dynamic together should be like one of the selling points, just like Men in Black, where you're like, well, that's the whole thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you said how this was originally like written by Shane Black and it was more of a buddy cop thing. And you think about like Lethal Weapon, and the whole thing with Lethal Weapon is like, the oil and vinegar, and then eventually they're going to come together and they're going to be, this sets that up, but then their relationship never really solidifies in a way that's necessarily like believable, or like it doesn't have that organic growth that all those great sort of buddy cop comedies. It's a classic trope of like, two guys are partnered up, they couldn't be more different, and eventually they're going to find commonalities, work together, save the day, blah, blah, blah. And like, it just, I think you're right. They both are trying to constantly one-up each other, and it never fully works. So,
yeah.
What about Salma Hayek? Because you sort of said she's got a very thankless role in this movie, which I couldn't agree more.
I just don't think that there's any arc for her character, but she's also too prominent in the movie to just be kind of like a Bond girl, right? She doesn't play a critical plot role. And there's sort of like a little payoff at the end where you're like, oh, she's actually like not who you think she is, but it doesn't really mean anything for the story. It's just kind of a bummer. Like, I feel like she's just really underutilized in the movie. That's pretty much my whole take on it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I think one of the biggest issues I have with the film is the sexual politics, and she suffers as a result. Like, her character suffers as a result of how this film just in general treats its women. So she's giving it her all, but she has very little to do. So,
yeah, totally. Okay, Kenneth Branagh though.
I mean,
oh my God. I love it. I think it's fantastic. I love seeing him do these types of roles. He's the king of ham.
He is the king of ham. Like, he's such a fascinating character. His career arc and everything about him fascinates me. Yeah, I think he's really good in it. The character is completely batshit. It speaks to the like weird tone of this movie. Like, is it a comedy? Is it an action movie? It is kind of messy in that regard. He kind of feels like maybe he's in a different movie from everybody else, but like he's giving it his all. It is one of the most unhinged performances of the year, no question.
It's me, dear friends. We may have lost the war, but heaven knows we haven't lost our sense of humor. No. Not even when we lost a lung, a spleen, a bladder, 2 legs, 35 feet of small intestine, and our ability to reproduce, all in the name of the South? Do we ever lose our sense of humor?
For sure. I mean, he is a character that has too much going on. like it has lost his legs and is in like a steam-powered wheelchair. But he also has like insane facial hair and like wears, I don't even know what the uniform is he wears at the end. Maybe like a German World War I uniform or like pre-World War I uniform.
Yeah, it's definitely meant to be like German military.
I mean, this is supposed to be like 1860s, so it's like even before that. But like I don't even know.
True. It does. Yeah, it hasn't existed yet, but yeah, exactly.
Right. And he's not a German character. I don't think. But anyway,
no, because he's got like a deep Southern accent, which is the other.
Right.
Like, again, Kenneth Branagh doing accent work is always fun because the man loves a hammy accent.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I did pull his filmography because it's just, again, fascinating where he's coming from. So some of the movies that he's done before this, Henry V.
Yeah.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which actually, is like starting to get into this territory maybe a little bit.
It's a weird movie, though.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but it's it's interesting because we did Dracula, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is, I guess, the prompt for making the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but I gather it's not as good, obviously, as
I mean, it has its defendants, but it is a weird movie.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan.
Yeah. So after that, it does Much Ado About Nothing, Othello, Hamlet, and then this.
Because that was the thing. He was the Shakespeare guy. Back in the 50s, Olivier, he did a bunch of Shakespearean movies. Obviously, Wells did a bunch of Shakespearean movies. And then, Branagh comes along and sort of revitalizes Shakespeare for, the 90s. And that Hamlet adaptation is, it's very, very long, but it's really good. That is a good movie. But then, to do something like this, it's sort of like, okay.
Yeah, totally. And then now, I feel like he is going through this renaissance a little bit with the Poirot movies, which I am a huge fan. I mean, the second one's really bad, but the first one and the third one, I think, are really good.
Yeah, they rule.
He's in a bunch of Christopher Nolan movies in the same period, and then he did Belfast in 2021 as well. So I feel like he's kind of riding high right now.
Yeah, he is a fascinating figure, no question.
Yeah, and just to build on the myth of Kenneth Branagh for a moment here, I did find this fun anecdote about him from the set. This is just a direct quote from an oral history from Mel magazine. Once the cast was assembled, a read-through took place on a horse ranch in Burbank. When Branagh arrived, he'd shaved his beard in the style of his character. He proceeded to dazzle the room with a committed Southern accent. He was amazing, says Sonnenfeld. He was so convincing, in fact, that Warner Brothers executive Lorenzo di Bonaventura asked Sonnenfeld if they should fire Branagh and cast whoever this guy was. Sonnenfeld told him that guy was Kenneth Branagh.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. I love that.
What a guy.
What a guy. All right. Let's talk about the storytelling, because I do feel like, this is where there are some challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so just for some context, Nate and I had planned to do this episode a few months ago. So we watched this movie a few months ago, and I think it says a lot about the fact that, we're recording it now, and I could not tell you the plot of this movie to save my life. Gun to my head, could not tell you the plot. It's kind of a mess. I enjoyed the movie very much, but script-wise, not particularly memorable.
Right. It's basically the same plot as The Mask of Zorro.
Yeah, a little bit,
It's almost, except that one is slightly more coherent and is a little bit more committed to what the actual thing is, but it's all about land, right? And redividing up the Americas among different powers, right? That's I guess what the plot is, but it really doesn't seem to care that much about the plot, which is fine because it's a Bond movie, basically, right? That's the way these go.
Yeah, it's a series of action set pieces strung together very loosely. The plot doesn't really matter. It's just how enjoyable are the set pieces, which to its credit, I think the set pieces are really fun. So that's fine.
Yeah, I generally agree. I'm going to give a little context on just how this came together, because I think it does speak a lot to the storytelling. But for one thing, when Peters, was giving his notes on the script, he did not know that it was a Western at the time.
Did he not read the title of the film?
I guess not. He didn't really have a sense of what the time period was. And so that's why there's a motorcycle in this movie, is because he thought horses were boring. And so he was we need a motorcycle in here.
Sure.
So at a certain point in the process, the screenwriters were basically ghosted. There was two that I mentioned earlier. Right. And they basically said that none of the material ended up in the movie except for one big thing, which I think you can probably guess what that one big thing is. And then Punch Up was done by 9 comedy writers.
Good Lord.
And then they did a whole bunch of reshoots. So the very opening scene where Will Smith is in the water tower with that young lady, that was reshot because apparently test audiences thought it was too PG, and so they wanted it to be a little bit more R-rated. So they reshot it with a different actress. I believe. I feel like in the oral history, maybe they also were the actors maybe didn't know. It was messy. All that stuff with the collars, that was all added. The lynching scene where Will Smith kind of gives a stand-up routine, that was added. So if those things weren't there, I feel like you could make more of a case for Will Smith being the straight man, right? But then I think probably they were showing it and they were oh, well, Will Smith isn't really doing the Will Smith thing. And that kind of muddies the whole dynamic.
Yeah, like the audiences are expecting Men in Black Will Smith, not, Ali Will Smith.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the question I want to ask, Adam, is like, I do feel like for most people, this movie goes off the rails at some point and you kind of like lose trust in the movie a little bit. Did that happen for you? And if so, when did it happen for you in the movie?
It's hard to say because, again, I did watch this like 2.5 months ago. But no, I don't think it did. I genuinely enjoyed myself watching this. I sort of also always say, like, you can tell my level of enjoyment of a film by how much I end up on my phone when I'm watching it at home. And I wasn't on my phone that much. I was engaged. I was laughing. I was enjoying the set pieces. Like, I wouldn't say I had the same level of, like, engagement as I did maybe with Mask of Zorro when I watched that for the first time.
Yeah.
But I did kind of have that similar, like, feeling of, like, this is a fun kind of movie that they don't make anymore. And yeah, it's messy, but like, I really enjoyed myself. Like, I guess maybe the spider comes along and you're like, okay, this is getting a little ridiculous. And like the twists in the final act are a little predictable, but like, I kept coming away being like, I don't really know why this movie has such a bad rap. Like, it's pretty fun.
Fair enough. And I feel like, on a second viewing, I feel like my opinion about this kind of firmed up a little bit more. But basically, my feeling is, I think the first act is actually really strong. I think it's a really good opening to the movie. It sets up the dynamics really nicely. There's some great, like, fun character moments for Will Smith, a fun introduction to Artemis Gordon. Even I feel like the introduction of Rita Escobar is also, like, pretty good. I think the second act is a little bit just like uneven. There's like a lot of stuff going on and it's messy, but like it's fairly enjoyable. And then I think the third act is kind of a disaster. And
fair.
It's funny because like the thing is, I kind of like the spider. I think the spider itself is kind of fun for a couple reasons. Like, I think that the effects actually are pretty good, like especially for the time. But like even today, I'm kind of like, it's not bad. It's definitely not that different than some of the Marvel movies you see today, which are like shot in an Atlanta parking lot and everything is composited anyways. It actually feels not dissimilar from that level of filmmaking right now. But there are also some things that like exceed that, where it's like, again, listening to the commentary, I was surprised by some of the places where he was like, oh yeah, that's composited, that's a matte painting, like that kind of stuff. Where it's like, like all the stuff in DC that they shot, it's shot in like California, and like all of the buildings are matte paintings. All of the buildings.
Yeah, totally.
So it's just like, that's pretty impressive. It's pretty seamless, right?
The thing that is most dated about the film is the sexual politics. Like, it's the CGI and the production design and the visual, like, I think actually hold up really, really well. So yeah, like I'm with you on that.
To go back to the third act for a minute, the parts that work for me are like when the spider is stomping through that town, right? Mm-hmm. That's pretty great. And it's partly because they actually burned that town down.
Right.
It's like,
yeah.
That's the set of the movie Silverado. And they like partially burned down that set. And then they also created like I think it was a 1/4 miniature that they also could blow up and stuff like that. And they enhanced that stuff with digital effects. But like there is actually debris. There is actually like stuff burning down. It's in a real place. Yeah. So like, even though there's a giant CGI spider, it does feel pretty good. The stuff that doesn't work as well for me is like that whole ending fight sequence on the spider feels surprisingly small to me. And like, that's the part that doesn't work. And it reminds me that like, I love Men in Black, but like the best parts of Men in Black actually aren't the action sequences. They're like the comedy that's sort of enhanced by bits and pieces of sci-fi and action, right? But like, do you even remember what the climax of that movie is?
There's a flying saucer that crashes. I remember that from the trailer. And that's all I really remember, to be honest.
Yeah. What I would say is like the setting for that and the whole sort of setup of it is great. But like the action moment at the end, as I recall, at least, is pretty fast. It's like, there's a giant bug basically that is like throwing them around and stuff. And then eventually they blow it up.
Yeah, the giant bug.
And it's gooey, right? But it's actually not like a great action sequence in the vein of like a Lethal Weapon. So it just makes me think about like what Barry Sonnenfeld's strengths are. And I do feel like that action sequence, for example, doesn't have any parallel action. It's like you're just watching Will Smith fight goons in the machine room of the giant spider. And meanwhile, like Artemis is just standing there for like 5 or 10 minutes doing nothing. Right? And there's no back and forth between them.
Well, it comes back to this issue of like their characters and the lack of chemistry between them. You know, it's funny when you were referencing Men in Black, it got me thinking about like Men in Black really sort of owes a debt to like Ghostbusters.
Sure.
And what's the magic of Ghostbusters? Yes, it's the special effects, but it's also the dynamic between the Ghostbusters. That's what makes that movie so memorable and why the subsequent films aren't as memorable. And so I think that is what does harm this film, is that by not nailing that relationship between our two main characters and maybe have them constantly vying for who is the main character, you'd lose out on the thing that should be making this work and probably where Sonnenfeld's strengths really lie, which is directing sort of like comedy, less so directing action set pieces.
Yeah. And like he does seem to surround himself with like good people, but you know, because the production was so messy of this, maybe it kind of got set back on that a little bit. But it's like, what I really want is I want like Artemis to be doing something. I want Jim to be doing something. And then I want the spider to be doing something. Like this, in that scene, the spider's just walking somewhere. And it's like,
exactly.
Why isn't there a countdown? Like the spider should be like, you know, approaching a city or should be doing something where you're like, they only have so much time to figure this out. But
totally.
Anyway, so like that's the part that feels the weakest to me. But again, like, the leading up to that, it's pretty good, other than some moments with sexual politics, which maybe we should get into.
Well, we need to talk about it. And I'm not trying to be like Mr. Woke or anything like that. I'm not being Gen Z, like I'm anti-sex in movies. But like, there's a time and a place. So it's interesting that you talk about the opening scene with Will Smith and the lady being reshot, because that scene feels so completely shoehorned it. Like, her breasts are literally like bobbing in the water.
Yeah.
It's like Austin Powers-ish levels of sexuality in this that just feel completely out of place otherwise. Like, in Austin Powers, it's satirical and it's for a reason and it's meant to be comedic. Whereas in this, it's just like, why? Why are we doing this? And then like the random close-ups on like Biling's ass and then like playing the lady's breasts like there's just a bunch of stuff that really make this feel awkward and dated and like you could not get away with that today. But it kept taking me out of the movie because I'm just like, whoa, like what was that for? Like really? And like again, like a James Bond movie, he's suave and debonair, but like the sex stuff in James Bond movies, I mean, yes, like some of the 60s stuff is awkward, you know, man talk, for example, or Chinese girls taste different. Like,
oh, God.
Some of this stuff is bordering on that, and it's 30 years later.
Are you a dangerous spy of some sort? Or just a handsome cowboy who likes to poke around?
I believe I'm that second one.
East and west.
Yeah. For me, I feel like there is a fine line that gets crossed several times where I'm kind of like, look, I'm fine actually with Kevin Kline in drag. I actually think that as a concept and like the set piece around it is actually totally fine.
Yep.
The part that sucks is when then they have the whole like conversation on the train about like feel my breasts, and the other guy on the train is like, oh man, I knew it. The whole sort of like gay panic bullshit that gets in there, which is very of the era.
Well, and not only that, but also the like gags that they then do with the woman who Will Smith thinks is Artemis, but is actually a woman.
Right.
And like some of that stuff just feels like unnecessarily mean. And then all of the stuff with Salma Hayek, it's just like she's just
the Salma Hayek stuff's
like
the real bummer.
She's a beautiful lady, but like she gets nothing to do, and it bums me out. That's the piece of this movie that feels the most dated, and also like it feels out of place for like the kind of stuff that's happening even at like, because this is the thing, it's 1999. Like, let's think of some of the other movies that come out this year. This is the year of Magnolia, Fight Club, The Matrix. Like, this movie feels kind of like passe by that point. And maybe that's part of why it critically suffers, because it feels like you're making a movie for a different era. And for me, it's not the set pieces that feel dated. It's not the CGI that feels dated. It's the way it treats its women that just really feels like something from 30 years prior.
Yeah. Well, and I think the sort of pinnacle of this, and again, probably the low point for the whole movie, is the Will Smith in drag scene, where he comes in and does a belly dance for Loveless, which again, a Jon Peters idea. Jon Peters loved the idea of men in drag. His big regret was that they didn't have a scene where both Will and Kevin Kline were in drag together.
Yes. Of course.
But that scene really sucks, and it's partly because it goes on for a really long time, and there's nothing
Way
really
too long, yeah.
There's nothing really to it. He just like shows up in drag, and Loveless is completely fooled by it. But it makes no sense that this woman would suddenly be there. It like interrupts something else that's going on that's completely different. And then Will is not really given anything to do. It feels like it's completely improvised, but there's also like no dialogue happening. It's just him like moving. And it's really rough.
That scene is funny though, because it feels like something out of a Simpsons episode. Like that feels like a Homer plot point. Like Homer has to pretend to be, you know what I mean? Like,
you know what it feels like? It feels like the Ganesha moment from this episode.
Yes, like
it's
totally
exactly like that. Except it wouldn't work in The Simpsons. The whole joke would be that Homer or someone thinks it's going to work,
exactly,
and then the person is completely not fooled because it's a dumb scheme. You know, but in this movie, it works, and it's kind of like a way to Band-Aid over the plot. So it's a real bummer. I bet for a lot of people, that was the moment where they were like, this movie, basically.
Yeah, totally.
Which is too bad, because there's some good stuff that happens after that moment, too. But I wish it wasn't there.
But I do want to talk about one of the things that I think this movie does have going for it, which is like its production design, special effects, and cinematography. Like, because I do think this movie looks great, as we've sort of alluded to.
Yeah. Again, a lot of people are coming over from Men in Black, and I feel like you can absolutely tell. Like, some of my favorite stuff in this movie is just the little touches of production design. All the props are great. The standout ones for me is when they get the guy's head near the beginning.
That's a man's head.
And then they use it as a projector, and they see his his last image that he saw. That stuff's amazing. They even get like the glow of his nose, the light coming through it, right? Like all those little details are so good. Very Men in Black. Big shout out to Bo Welch, who's the production designer. Rick Baker does the makeup. Doug Harlocker does the props. And they all worked on Men in Black, I think. It's very inspiring. One of the questions I had was like, what other steampunk movies kind of even existed before this? This has got to be in contention for like one of the best designed steampunk movies by this point, you know?
Yeah, definitely. We've sort of talked about this magical era. You know, it's that late 90s period where CGI exists and it's gotten very good, but it's not good enough that they can rely on it 100%. You know, I think most people sort of cite Lord of the Rings as like the last movie in that vein of like, they're using CGI to enhance all of their practical effects. This is one of those movies where it's just like, I think the reason everything stands the test of time is because like they do have to do a bunch of stuff practically, and it's just like we're using CGI to, you know, composite stuff to smooth over some of the edges, to just tie everything together, but we're not just relying on it to do everything. Like, you know, even the classic thing of like Marvel movies, even the suits are CGI, like nothing's real. So this is an era of visuals that I love. And I mean, some of it is nostalgic, but like my love here is not nostalgic because I didn't see the movie before. This is that period where they just really are able to do really incredible stuff, and it holds up. You know, it's 20 years later and it still looks awesome. Even in HD too, because that's the other thing too, is like sometimes when they make that move to HD, the seams are a little more noticeable, but like nothing sort of took me out being like, ooh, that looks janky as shit. I think this movie looks awesome.
Yeah. There are definitely like a few blue screen moments where like the compositing of specifically the actors over the background sometimes shows some scenes. But again, as I said, like there are other moments that you wouldn't even know that they're doing any kind of compositing or effects that just totally work. One of the things that struck me was the sort of steam wheelchair for Arliss's character, right? Like the way they do that, again, is like using the best technology of the time, because it must be fairly recent at this point where you can program a camera to do the exact same move.
Yeah, the motion control stuff.
You know, again and again. Right. Yeah. And so they basically use that and do 3 passes. One with Brana in the wheelchair, then they do one with just the wheelchair, and then they do one with nothing. And then that gives them the material to do the compositing and like take out his legs and get the shadows right and all that kind of stuff. And it's like in those shots, it's just totally seamless. It always looks great in this movie. So it's stuff like that that I find really, really, really impressive.
When I was listening to the commentary, he talked a little bit about the second unit, and I thought this was really interesting. So Michael Ballhaus is credited as the cinematographer, but a number of shots and sequences were done by the second unit director and the second unit director of photography, who is Bill Pope. Do you know Bill Pope, Nate?
I know one thing that Bill Pope did, which is The Matrix, right?
Yeah. So the guy had a busy year. Yeah. He did a couple of the Edgar Wright movies, including, I'm pretty sure he did Scott Pilgrim, which I love.
Okay.
And
yeah, totally.
He is also the go-to cinematographer for Sam Raimi, like back in those days. So like he's sort of like a classic genre cinematographer. Like he's great at doing this sort of thing.
Yeah. And like I would say, you know, again, I'm not sure where the line is between Bauhaus and Pope, but like you can definitely see some through lines in all of those movies of the like really stylized camera work that fits right in with like a comic book adaptation. Like there's one shot in particular that now would 100% be done with just CGI, where they're doing the golden spike ceremony, right? And it's like the president is finishing off the railroad and he turns around as we all know that the giant spider's coming. And there's a shot of the president's face, and then it pulls back very, very quickly, and then you see the spider's leg come down into the frame. And that shot is done practically. Like, that's amazing. It's like they pulled it back for 4 minutes, and then ILM took every fourth frame out or something like that to speed it up to the right level. But it's like, that feels like something that's kind of impossible. Like, you couldn't just dolly back that quickly. There's just no way. But like it's done practically. And so that's actually a feat of cinematography with like a little assist from special effects. And again, that's sort of what this movie is at its best. Same goes for things like Spider-Man or Scott Pilgrim, like definitely has a lot of cinematography moments like that.
Well, we've sort of talked about it a bunch already, but let's get to it. The giant spider climax. I mean, Nate, you said you don't hate it, and I admittedly don't hate it, but what are your takeaways from this shoehorned in element?
I mean, this is the thing that's interesting that came up when I was researching this, because I was like, you know, you hear the Kevin Smith story, but the Kevin Smith story sort of yada yadas the actual, like, how does this end up in Wild Wild West, right? And you assume, based on the story, that, well, it's like obviously Jon Peters asked for this. So I started looking into the production history, and supposedly that's actually not the case.
Oh.
Apparently, this was in the script from Maddock and Wilson. They say it's the only thing that actually came from their script that ended up in the final movie.
Wild.
So it was they say that it was actually their idea, and they took it to Jon Peters, and his office rejected it.
Okay.
Jon Peters wanted a stealth bomber, speaking to the earlier point of him not really knowing what era this takes place in, because again, this is before the Wright brothers. Yes. There are no airplanes. There is a Wright brothers plane in this movie, but it's like recognized as something that's like ahead of its time. He wanted a stealth bomber. And of course, everyone was like kind of nervous about this, the writers in particular. And so basically the spider ends up in the movie because Barry sort of catches wind of this idea of the stealth bomber. And he's like, I don't know, that sounds kind of sketchy. And like someone in the back, maybe one of the writers is like, well, you know, originally he was actually a spider. And he's like, oh, interesting. And then one of the execs is like, I second that idea. And that's how it ends up in the movie. But it actually supersedes an idea from Jon Peters, supposedly. So I have a few questions for you. Number one, do we believe this story, or do we actually think that it is Jon Peters, in fact, and maybe there's some kind of weird whitewashing situation going on? Or do we think the writers are just telling the truth? This is their idea, and it's totally a coincidence. Because all the other Jon Peters spider stuff is pretty confirmed, it seems like.
I mean, yeah, like Peters himself makes it very clear in that Superman documentary that he wanted a giant spider in there. So, like, I guess it could just be a weird coincidence. Like, it does seem odd that he would be so obsessed with it that he would then be like, no, you gotta put a steampunk spider in. So, like, I guess I kind of believe them. If it's a coincidence, it's one of the weirdest, wildest coincidences. Because I think there was another movie, can't remember if Kevin Smith alludes
to it
or... Right, yeah. So he's wanted a giant spider in multiple movies before. So... I don't know. I don't know who to believe at this point.
It may just speak to the erraticness of Jon Peters, of like, maybe, you know, he just had completely forgotten about that idea by that point. Or maybe the writers had kind of heard rumors and like were
that's what I would buy is like, that feels more accurate to me, is that like it was their idea because I'm doing air quotes because like they had heard about this rumor and were like, well, maybe if we put this in, like he'll like it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, like the Steve Jobs thing, because it wasn't his idea, he didn't want it. But then like you convince him it's his idea. Who knows? But that's wild. Like, it's wild. Because to your point, like it makes no logical sense otherwise to include it. Like why?
Well, so here, let me give you the quote from one of the writers.
Okay.
So he says, I was a huge fan of stop motion animation and Ray Harryhausen and all those things, and the technology of computer generation was evolving. It was right at the point where machines were an easy thing to do because they had joints.
Because they're rigid,
they didn't have skin that needed to fold and wrinkle and close and all of that stuff. I knew that the walking machine would be a standout thing, and that's why I pushed for it initially, and then it fell out, and then it went back in at the last minute. So he was basically like writing it knowing that the effects were right for this kind of thing, but like not right for other types of big set pieces. So very interesting.
But it has nothing to do with the Wild West. Like that's the whole thing. It's called Wild Wild West. Like I don't know. It seems dubious.
Yeah. I mean, I do think one of the funny things about this movie that I don't think I really knew before watching it or rewatching it was like they really lay the spider stuff in really early. Like, everything related to Arliss is, you know, spider themed. So that I guess the idea is by the time the spider shows up, you're kind of like conditioned to know that like, oh yeah, he loves spiders. That makes sense. Even though, it doesn't really make any sense at all.
No.
But
no. I mean, sense
it's just another gadget-y thing.
I guess. Did Sonnenfeld in his commentary like address the spider at all, or like did he wisely just sort of? Yeah, okay. So even that, the fact that he doesn't address it leads me to think that like even there's. I don't know, man.
Yeah, but what I'll say is the commentary doesn't address most of the stuff that you learn from the oral histories and the interviews and all of that kind of stuff.
Yes, it is a very bizarre commentary.
A lot. Yeah, and the only thing that he says basically about Jon Peters is at the very, very end of the commentary during the credits. He's basically like, and just a small warning for young directors, Jon Peters will at some point touch your testicles as the way to make a point. More ominously, he does then say, I don't know what he does to women. So
Jesus Christ.
So yeah. It was like a funny moment followed by a very, very dark moment. But I can't believe that's in the DVD commentary.
Well, it's because they weren't worried about anybody buying this DVD, Nate.
Yes, exactly.
I think you and I might be the only people who have listened to the commentary. And I didn't even finish the commentary. Now I want to finish it.
It's like a podcast Patreon episode. It's like, we're behind the paywall.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, man.
Not to go back to James Bond, but people are maybe familiar with the famous quote-unquote banned Criterion Bond commentaries because Criterion Collection put out a couple of James Bond movies on Laserdisc and maybe even on DVD. I think only on Laserdisc. And in them, they have these commentary tracks that have subsequently been scrubbed because the people in them were very open about stories and like calling people like homophobes and stuff like this. Wow. And there was a period where whenever you would start a DVD, they would also have like a disclaimer where it'd be like, the opinions expressed in this commentary do not reflect the opinions. So
like
that's
the Simpsons
why,
commentaries are like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're trying to shelter themselves from whatever these people might say.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's wild. But yeah, again, and Spider, I enjoyed it. I laughed. I did have the like, okay, now I finally have seen it. It's not as bad as I thought it would be, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think you're right. I think there's definitely flaws with it, but yeah, it's fun. I don't know.
For sure. Well, okay, I guess we got to end just like the movie does with the original credit song produced by Will Smith.
Wild Wild West, Jim West, Desperado, Rough Rider, no you don't want nada. Artemis from the start of it, running the game, James West, taming the West, so remember the name.
The song rules. I'm not a big hip-hop guy, and I'm definitely not a big Will Smith guy, but it helps that it's sampling Stevie Wonder.
The Wild Wild West, when I roll into the Wild Wild West, when I stroll into the Wild Wild West, when I bounce into the Wild Wild West.
But yeah, no, I love it. The cool Modi. It features Cisco, a pre-thong song Cisco, which really dates this track. But it is this funny period where, like, I think it's Addams Family Values, the second Addams Family movie, which is also directed by Barry Sonnenfeld, has a rap at the end of the movie by MC Hammer. Like there was that period where every like 90s blockbuster ended with a rap that sort of like talks about the plot of the movie. Addams Family has one. I think the Ninja Turtles movie has one. This has one. Like it was definitely a thing.
Men in Black.
Yeah, Men in Black. Like, and so this is sort of like the tail end of that. And I don't know, maybe that's what Marvel needs to do is they need to bring back a PG hip hop artist to rap the plot synopsis of the movie.
I love it.
I mean, The Simpsons even have the joke. We talked about it in the Mark of Zorro episode.
From the Z to the O to the double R-O, he's a dude in a mask from the barrio.
That's what it's riffing on. Yeah. That's how common this was.
Deep Blue Sea is what they're sort of specifically referencing. But it's interesting. I didn't really peg that it's a trend that maybe Barry Sonnenfeld actually has a huge role in.
I don't know. I don't know if
he's...
Yeah.
Well, I mean, going back to Addams Family Values, that's pretty far back, right?
That's like 93, 94. But
that's pretty early.
I can't remember which Ninja Turtles movie it's in because I'm not super deep on Ninja Turtles lore. I just know from other podcasts that reference it all the time. It might be the first Ninja Turtles movie, which is late 80s, so it definitely goes pretty far back there. But yeah. Needless to say,
it's a cousin to like the Disney movie thing too. Of like Disney movies always had the pop version of this at the end of their movie. That's usually a cover of sometimes an original song, sometimes a cover of a previous song and soundtrack. But yeah, this is the like hip teenage / adult version of the same idea, basically.
It's synergy, baby. It's Prince on the Batman soundtrack.
Hell yeah.
You can sell albums, I guess.
It's true. Jon Peters probably loved that idea.
Totally.
Okay, Adam, I did want to try something slightly new. Since it's a new year, we're starting a new tranche of movies. We've always done on the show the parts that feel like Simpsons jokes but aren't. And I thought we could maybe expand that a little with a few more Simpsons questions at the end of every movie to just like bring it back to the show and have some fun riffing on this. So this is what I'm calling the Simpsons Speed Round. And it is 5 questions that we're going to run through fairly quickly, including that one. So let's start there. Right. Simpsons Speed Round. Are there any moments in this movie that feel like Simpsons jokes but aren't?
Yes, I think we sort of alluded to it. I think the Will Smith belly dance thing very much feels like something Homer would have done.
Yeah. Hey, look, it's this thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, totally. The other one that stuck out to me that we actually haven't talked about yet is the entrance of Loveless, which is like they're at a party and then they wheel out a giant head of Abraham Lincoln that then explodes in like a bloody mess and he's inside of it.
Yep.
I was like, that feels like a great Simpsons gag. Awesome.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. Did you learn anything about The Simpsons from this movie?
I don't think so, although I guess the thing that's interesting is that, again, this is one of those rare instances of them referencing a relatively contemporary film, which is so rare for them. So it just goes to show what this giant mechanical spider has a place in popular culture, that's the thing that they are choosing to reference.
Yeah,
especially knowing that this film wasn't this massive success. It's from this incredible year of cinema that people talk about all the time. So many films from 1999 they could be choosing to reference, and they're choosing Wild Wild West. So that's, am I learning anything? Maybe not, but it is an interesting fact that this is what they chose to look at.
Totally. My big takeaway was, as the series goes on, up until the point where we sort of are stopping our watch in season 13, the later seasons really seem interested in flops. Like they become more and more interested in flops over time. Like the early seasons are like classic movies that are like AFI Top 100 type movies. And then over time, they do more things like this or like Paint Your Wagon or like other kind of like notorious flops. Right. They also do like The Postman, right? That's another one.
The Waterworld game.
Yeah, the Waterworld game. Feels like David Merkin kind of introduced that cynicism about Hollywood, and it feels like it continues into these seasons.
Totally.
Okay, does this movie still have some juice for more Simpsons parodies?
This one's tough because it's like obviously the setting of it makes it trickier. Like it's not a contemporary storyline, and certainly like at this point it would be very bizarre for The Simpsons to reference a 1999 flop. But the Simpson-y element of this movie feels like there's a place that they could maybe come back to. But if this is not enough of a classic for it to make sense.
Yeah, that's sort of where I landed as well. Like, because I love their Zorro parody so much, I kind of would love to see them play a little bit more in these like weird blockbustery semi-historical, movies of this era. And you could like maybe toss something in from this movie, but like overall, not really. I think they've kind of juiced this one as much as they can. Are there any characters in this movie that could become a recurring Simpsons side character?
I will say we didn't really talk about it, but Ted Levine sort of like I literally had to look it up. I was like, is that Ted Levine? Because of course the only thing I know Ted Levine from is from playing the murderer in Silence of the Lambs, but he plays the henchman with a gramophone ear.
I love that.
Which feels very kind of like Simpsons-y, and I could see that being maybe not that specific character, but it's sort of like there's a Simpsons element to that feels like something similar could be in their world for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't come up with one for this. Loveless is kind of covered by Professor Frink, as he is in the parody in this episode, pretty well. He's actually maybe too outlandish for The Simpsons. Same goes even for that. It's like that almost feels like it could be something in Disenchanted, the sort of other...
Or even Futurama.
Or Futurama, the sister-brother Matt Groening projects that have a little bit more of the genre stuff in them. I feel like it could totally work in that vein. But Simpsons is maybe a little too grounded. All right, last question. Are there other movies by this director or in this franchise, this isn't really a franchise, that The Simpsons should parody?
Well, looking at Sonnenfeld's filmography, no. At least not his directorial work. I think maybe from his cinematographic work. Is that the right term? Like, Coen Brothers stuff, I feel like you could maybe riff on in the Simpsons
It's amazing
universe, but...
they haven't done more Coen Brothers, honestly, because it does feel perfect for them. Like, Fargo or Blood Simple or any of those of that era, or like even Raising Arizona.
Raising Arizona feels kind of like a Simpsons. I haven't seen Raising Arizona, but I know the sort of like beats of the plot, and that just feels like a Simpsons episode in and of itself, right? Like that could very easily be translated to a Simpsons episode.
Yeah, they've done like small references to it. Like the booking scene, I think, is the one that they've sort of like parodied a few times. But like, the overall plot or like other parts of it, I feel like definitely they could take a little more from. I said Men in Black. It would have to be like a Trios of Horror episode, but like it's so good, and it like is a classic that is now old enough that I feel like you could go back to it and like kind of riff on that a little bit. But it's such a good premise that I feel like you could have a lot of fun in that world with some of the characters.
Well, Nate, with all that being said, do you think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses on this film?
Wow. I mean, I'm gonna say no.
Okay. Interesting.
I'm gonna say no because I do think there are some fatal flaws in this, but I think that this movie does get a worse rap than it deserves. I will say that. I didn't have some fun moments with this movie overall.
Well, maybe let me put it a different way. You don't think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses, but would you recommend people watch it?
Yeah, I feel like if you like this kind of movie, like if you like Men in Black or you like Zorro or you like any of those types of movies that are in this weirdly specific 90s subgenre of like semi-historical action blockbusters, there aren't that many of them, right? That's the reality, is that there's only a handful of them that are worth watching. And this one is like, entertaining enough. If you want to just like pass a night away and have a movie that like will entertain you at times and is also like has some laughably bad moments, like you're probably going to have a good evening. So yeah, I think I would recommend it to people who are fans of this subgenre for sure.
Right.
What about you, Adam?
I mean, I disagree in the sense that I think the strengths do outweigh the weaknesses. Like there's definitely flaws with this movie, but I don't think they're deal breakers for me. I guess I'm grading on a curve. Like if I'm grading this alongside the other films released that year, this would not crack the like top 5 you should watch.
For sure.
But if you're grading it against these kind of movies that were released in the last 5 years, I genuinely would choose this. I'm not trying to be Mr. Anti-Marvel or anything, but like I think this is better than like anything that Marvel has put out in the last little while. Better than anything DC has put out maybe since the Dark Knight series. Like it's a fun popcorn movie. Like that's it's the classic thing, the Mark Kermode thing of like it does what it says on the tin. It is a Hollywood adaptation of a 60s TV series with a giant spider, and you go in knowing that it's fun. Like, I had a fun time. Yeah. It's an easy watch. Like, it's not a slog. It's not too long.
Yeah.
It's a perfect, like, Friday night, throw on a movie, make a bowl of popcorn. You know, if you want to have a drink or two, you can. I went into this with so much trepidation. I thought I was walking into another friggin' paint your wagon situation. Like, I was going to be rage texting Nate throughout it, being like, why did you make me watch this thing? I didn't. I enjoyed myself. So I think if you go into it with your expectations set properly, you'll enjoy yourself.
I totally agree with that. And I do think that, to your point about Marvel, like, that was immediately where my brain went, is like comparing it to the last couple of years. And when I look at those types of movies that fill that same block, right, of like popcorn blockbusters, I think this is more entertaining than Quantumania. Genuinely, you will have a better time watching this than you will watching that movie. The jokes feel fresher, even though they're also, like, you know, inappropriate by today's standards. There are some genuinely, like, laugh out loud moments, and then the action and special effects and stuff is, like, at least as impressive. I know that movie like famously had kind of unfinished effects, but still, like, it went to theaters, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the one thing I will say about this movie is it's clearly a movie made by committee. Yes. Which is why I keep comparing it to Marvel movies. But it is not a movie that feels paint by numbers. You're going to see some stuff you've never seen before when you watch this. And, like, you got to give it credit for that. What about for extra credit? What else would you pair this with, maybe?
Yeah. So, I mean, the obvious one, just go and listen to our episode on The Mask of Zorro, because it's very much like same era, same subgenre. We gave that movie like a ringing endorsement in that episode. So that's a great one. And you can listen along with us about what we thought about it. But the other movie that we're probably not going to cover was Sherlock Holmes from 2009. The Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah.
You know, like, I actually have a soft spot for that series. You know, it's diminishing returns, but the first one felt really fresh at the time. It's one of the better things that Guy Ritchie has done in the last, you know, I don't even know, since Snatch. But again, it's very much in this vein, similar time period, I think, but then has the sort of like wacky gadgets and that kind of stuff. It's a buddy comedy with like a big scheme. So like, it feels very much the same type of movie, and like one of the few franchises I feel like pursuing this tone in the 2000s.
It gets that relationship business that we say this film struggles with. It knows and understands how to handle that much better. I loved it when we saw it in theaters together, and then like on subsequent rewatches it sort of doesn't necessarily hold up as well, but it's still still fun.
You're also a big Sherlock Holmes fan, and I think it's not necessarily a great Sherlock Holmes adaptation, but it's a kind of a fun movie in this genre, right? Because it's like they really take some liberties with his character. But if you just like change the names around and we're like, it's like a Sherlock Holmes-like movie, totally. Then I think those expectations, you could kind of set them aside and be like, yeah, whatever. It's a movie like Wild Wild West.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. The CGI in that movie does not hold up, though. Polar opposite of this situation.
Interesting.
But it's funny that you mentioned Guy Ritchie, because I was struggling to come up with something, and I was like, oh, maybe I should pick something in the vein of like 60s reboot, like a sequel type thing. And so I went with The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which I don't know. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that, actually.
So again, I haven't seen it since I saw it in the theaters, but I really enjoyed it when I saw it in the theaters. You know, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was a TV series that was basically made in response to James Bond, and then was made as a rebooted movie by Guy Ritchie. The thing I love about it is that it does the thing that I kind of wish the James Bond series would do, which is it's set in the 60s. So you can have like the gender politics, and they play with that in an interesting way. You can do gadgets that don't feel like weird and out of place, because like now we have cell phones and we don't need gadgets anymore. Like it allows them to play in a sandbox that is really fun and references all those things that you love from that sort of era. So I think that one's worth checking out. And also checking out Addams Family Values, a movie which I had never seen until this October. I watched both Addams Family movies back to back. And the first one I was really disappointed in, but everyone said that the second one was better. And so I watched the second one sort of being like, oh, I hope it's better than the first, and being like, oh yeah, this eats the first movie for lunch. Like that movie is so fun, and another Sonnenfeld joint. So yeah, definitely check that out.
Love that. And then of course, you know, Men in Black. I mean, we've been referencing it this whole time, and so I didn't feel like it needed to be said, but like Men in Black is kind of the better version of this movie. It's not a Western, but besides that, it's a very similar idea.
Totally. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, and we just want to thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review. I think we're going to start reading reviews maybe in this section. So, if you want to get a shout out on the show, leave a review and maybe we'll share it with our listeners. Just like you should share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We haven't been great about mentioning this, but we did set up a support page on our website where if you want, you can throw us a couple of bucks to help cover the cost of making this show. We really appreciate that. And until next time, Nate?
For me, the war is over!
We'll see you around the Plex.
And this is where we drop the Wild Wild West theme. To the Wild Wild West, going Great. Okay,
that turned into like a Muppets situation near the end.
It sure did. It sure did. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Wicked wild.